Hello, and thank you for inviting me here to speak about Oromo transnationalism. Oromo transnationalism is a subject near and dear to me, in part because I spent my time as a graduate student studying Oromo transnational activity and institution building in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. I'm delighted that OSA centered this very important area of inquiry. So let's begin. Today, due to advances in communication and transportation technologies, immigrant ties to the homeland are not radically ruptured as they had been generations ago. The cross border flows of information, networks, and imaginaries between immigrants and those living in the home country exemplify the transnational character of the immigrant experience today. Oromo transnationalism is not new. It is my contention that transnationalism has been a characteristic feature of the modern Oromo immigrant experience since its inception in the 1970s. In this paper, I argue that immigrant memories of repression, diaspora advocacy, and the establishment of ethnic institutions in Western countries laid the institutional and discursive foundation on which the newest phase of Oromo transnational advocacy was built. This paper seeks to address the role that memory and old and new media play in informing and shaping the diaspora's current advocacy efforts in response to the Oromo protests of 2014 through 2017. So, what is transnationalism? The literature on transnationalism emerged in order to theorize the changes to the immigrant experience associated with the restructuring of the global economy, time-space compression, facilitated by advances in communication and transportation technologies, and the rise of multiculturalism and discourses on democracy. In its most basic sense, transnationalism can be defined as the maintenance of cross-border ties between the host and the home country by immigrants. This ability to maintain connections to the homeland influences how immigrants shape their identities, and it also influences the character of immigrant institutions established in the host country. So let's move on to a discussion of early Oromo transnationalism in the diaspora. Discussions of Oromo transnationalism seem novel and even trendy because the subject is understudied. But it is my contention that Oromo transnationalism and transnational advocacy have been a characteristic feature of the modern Oromo immigrant experience. Starting in the 1960s and continuing thereafter, Ethiopia was beset by the Ethiopian student movement, separatist movements, and ethnic nationalism. By the 1970s, Oromo descent was met with government persecution, which led to the mass exodus of many educated Oromos, including those that became the subject of my own research. Prior to the establishment of Oromo ethnic-based institutions in the diaspora, Oromo concerns were rendered silent in pan-Ethiopian institutions. Dissatisfied with the inability of mainstream and leftist Ethiopian institutions to address ethnic inequality in Ethiopia, a small but vocal set of the Oromo immigrant community set out to create their own ethnic-based institutions in the United States and beyond. Because the political conditions in Ethiopia were and continue to be repressive, and because internal dissent was virtually outlawed in the country during the 1970s and 80s, the Oromo diaspora became the communicative organ through which Oromo critiques and grievances were articulated globally. In addition, the freedom of expression and association that life in diaspora afforded early immigrants made it possible for Oromos to establish ethnic institutions from which they challenged and continue to challenge Oromo economic, political, and academic marginalization in Ethiopia. The first organizations that they founded in places like in Washington D.C. Were organizations like the Union of Oromo Students of North America and the Union of Oromo Students in Europe. By the mid-1980s, organizations like the Oromo Studies Association was formed to provide more extensive and academic treatment of Oromo topics. Oromo scholars in the diaspora expressed their agency through discourse and played a role in altering not only how the Oromo viewed themselves in and out of Ethiopia, but they also influenced the ways in which Western and Ethiopian scholars viewed and wrote about the Oromo. They inserted Oromo history, concerns, and the Oromo perspective into academic scholarship where it had been absent. By the 1990s, Oromo churches and community organizations began to flourish. And so there you have the development of the institutional basis for advocacy. Now I want to provide a brief and general list of the types of advocacy activities that were common among the Oromo in the diaspora from the early 1980s to the early 2000s. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. It is simply a list that seeks to provide those things, those advocacy efforts that were common and widespread among different diaspora communities. So I'll just read you a list, really. So again, examples of early transnational advocacy and transnationalism include the staging of joint and or global protest on behalf of the Oromo in opposition to Ethiopian government repression, fundraising to support the victims of state terror. They provided financial support to Oromo refugee communities in the Horn of Africa. The Oromo Relief Association was a very early example of this effort, of this transnational effort. They established organizations like the Oromo Support Group and other human rights monitoring institutions that sought to note, monitor, and keep record of human rights violations perpetrated against Oromos in and outside of Ethiopia. Many Oromo individuals and communities engaged in letter writing campaigns in opposition to Oromo victimization. They established radio and later TV programs to address the experience of both Oromo immigrants and Oromos living in Oromia. They played a role in the formation of the Kube writing system or alphabet. They established Oromo internet news sites, groups, and forums that shared Oromo-related news from Ethiopia and from the diaspora. And finally, in the creation of community centers and other institutions, Oromo immigrants assisted in the resettlement process of new immigrants, and they also provided a space for the socialization of the second generation of Oromos. As was discussed above, the Oromo have engaged in many forms of transnationalism and transnational advocacy prior to their most recent efforts on behalf of the Oromo protest. If this is the case, what is different about the current moment? Why is it that we feel that this period is different from, the previous period? So I think the protest movement and the diaspora response to the movement could be represented as a perfect storm with four factors that combine to produce the conditions out of which the Oromo protests and the global response to them emerge. So again, it is my view that four features or four factors influence the conditions out of which the protest and our response emerge. So the first one is youth precarity in the face of development. The second factor is increased government repression. The third factor is the maturation of the diaspora and its political networks. And four, we have the presence of Oromo media outlets with the transnational reach, coupled with the rise in the use of social media in and outside of Oromia. So at this point, I want to address all four factors. So number one, youth precarity in the face of development. The benefits of Ethiopia's decade-long streak of economic growth have not reached the Oromo majority. The land grabs that this type of economic development engender are influenced by a new phase of extractive capitalism, not based on the development of manufacturing or a strong middle class or even government safeguards. Instead, the logic of this new system increases the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite. There is government and safety net contraction, and most importantly, a tendency toward expulsion, resulting in precarity, especially for Ethiopian youth. Precarity involves the increasing shifts in labor that lead to temporary, contract, and other insecure forms of employment and downward mobility. It is this fate that awaited many of those removed from their lands in various parts of Oromia under the guise of Ethiopian development. In addition, the youth are more educated than previous generations, which led to increased expectations for employment outside of the agricultural sector. During the Selassie regime and also during the Derg period, the government, in a sense, attempted to absorb its educated workforce, but since the 1990s, the percentage of people employed by the government has declined. In addition, because of the concentration of opportunities in a few major cities and ethnic discrimination, many educated Oromo youth have found themselves locked out of progress and development. The second factor that shaped the character of the protest and the diaspora's response was government repression. The government repression of children, women, and young adults sparked outrage in the diaspora and compelled immigrant individuals and community organizations to advocate on behalf of the protesters. The third factor that shaped diaspora advocacy efforts was the maturation of its institutions and community members. The diaspora was no longer just composed of refugees or new arrivals that were attempting to deal with the stress of resettlement. Oromo diaspora communities were more stable, larger, and had developed community institutions that could be mobilized quickly to attend to the protest. Their integration in America, Europe, and Australia was important because it allowed them to use their networks, or the networks they gained, in the host country to act on behalf of the Oromo and Ethiopia. The last factor that influenced the environment out of which both the protest and diaspora advocacy emerged was connected to the proliferation of Oromo news outlets and the rise in the use of social media platforms to rapidly share information about Oromo issues globally. Now I'll take some time to talk about factor 4 because it is essential to understanding the nature of the protest and how the diaspora responded to them globally. So because of persecution and the lack of free press and political expression in Ethiopia was circumscribed, the Oromo diaspora, since its inception, played a definitive role in sharing information about Oromo history, culture, and marginalization using traditional media and the internet. What is unique about Oromo transnational activism today is that it is occurring in a shared space of identity articulation that I call the Oromo identisphere, made possible by the internet in general and social media in particular. The internet and social media allow the radical opening up of alternative spaces of communication and engagement that bypass traditional channels and help to create cross-border or transnational public spheres without having to act through traditional, local, national, or international media institutions. Web 2.0 creates a new kind of collectively produced news by citizens committing independent or coordinated acts of journalism as an important alternative to mainstream media. The global flow of information facilitated by Facebook and Twitter and news sites like OMN, OPride, and sites like Gada.com and many others not only created spaces of information sharing, the comment sections of these spaces allowed the creation of powerful imaginaries enabling aspirations of transboundary political practice even when the actors involved were localized. The technologies, institutions, and imaginaries that mark the current global digital manifestations associated with the Oromo protests inscribe local practice with new global meaning and potentialities. Social media should no longer be seen as an activity set apart from other social activities. Online activity may connect disorganized crowds and enable the formation of new networked publics that can be activated and sustained by feelings of belonging and solidarity. So in the time that I have left, I would like to review the transnational advocacy efforts of the diaspora in support of the Oromo protest. So it is my view that the protests and the diaspora response to them can be separated into 3 phases. So phase 1 is marked by the rise of youth in Ethiopia and the diaspora and awareness campaigns. In the spring of 2014, the Ethiopian government announced the Addis Ababa Integrated Development Master Plan and the first Oromo peaceful protests started in Ambo and later spread to other cities. The government's excessive use of force in response to the peaceful protests of students sparked outrage in the diaspora. This period marks the introduction of the second generation into diaspora advocacy efforts. Second generation Oromo youths had their own networks, skills, and institutions that they used to start the advocacy movement in response to the protests. They felt compelled to act because they had been reared by trans migrants that socialized them as Oromos, though they lived in the diaspora. Their parents shared memories with their children of Oromo repression that were activated by the images of the protest. As a result, Oromo youths living in America, Europe, Australia, and in the Middle East utilized social media to bring awareness about the protests in an effort to combat both the silence and misinformation about the protest, with the aim to really end the violence that was taking place. The youth learned from the Bedele beer boycott that social media had the potential to enact change. Oromo youths created the Oromo protest hashtag. The International Oromo Youth Association, or IOYA, produced a short film about the protests, and they also sent 2 representatives to the United Nations to speak on behalf of the Oromo children and youth impacted by the protests. Members of the first generation coordinated global protests in support of the Oromo in Ethiopia and raised funds to help the families of victims. Phase 2 of the protests. Phase 2 of the protests began in November or December of 2015, when the protests resumed in response to the announcement that the Ethiopian government would move forward with the master plan. The Oromo protests spread rapidly throughout the country, as did protester demands. The protests reawakened hope in the diaspora for the potential for change in Ethiopia. The government crackdown was severe and continued unabated, and caused the diaspora to expand its efforts. So instead of just focusing on bringing awareness to Oromos and the Western community, the Oromo communities around the world engaged in coordinated efforts at the local level to speak with Western governments in order to enlist their support in pressuring the Ethiopian government to end its violent treatment of protesters and to open up political space for democracy in Ethiopia. One of the first victories of this phase was the EU's resolution on the crisis in the United States. Diaspora community organizations held joint meetings and conference calls to train people in advocacy. Through the efforts of many communities across the country, the diaspora was able to get enough support from local officials to introduce a Senate resolution and gain many supporters of that resolution. In addition, there were fundraising campaigns and concerts to support the protest victims. Social media use spiked, and this phase was marked by the digital crystallization of a virtual space of communication between the Oromo in Ethiopia and the diaspora. This level of communication between the diaspora and the homeland was not possible in the past. Lalisa, his protest at the Olympics brought renewed attention to the Oromo protest. And during this phase, there was unprecedented coverage of the protest in most major news sources. The Oromo protest was the 3rd most popular story about Africa in 2016. So let's look at phase 3. So phase 3 begins in October of 2016 and continues into the present. And it really is characterized by the state of emergency that Ethiopia issued in response to the unrest that was taking place at the time. During this phase, the diaspora's advocacy efforts have focused on leadership and the bureaucratization of the movement. With the state of emergency, Ethiopia attempted to halt the coming together of various segments of the transnational Oromo body politic by shutting down access to the internet, banning diaspora news sites, and limiting cell phone use as a means to stifle this connection, which was an alternative source of support for the protesters. The government control of media resources and its arrest of tens of thousands of potential protesters resulted in a decline in both the protest and in information about the protest. The diaspora has spent this time, strategizing and theorizing about how to best move forward in their advocacy efforts in support of the protest movement, and how to move it from a decentralized, leaderless movement to one with support that is more formal. One trend that I witnessed during this phase has been the creation of independent advocacy groups and coalition groups, all seeking to increase capacity and the ability to deepen their advocacy efforts in the future. So at this phase, I think the Oromos are trying to sort of figure out a way